text before we researched. They had slave owner, and he was not. He was a slave. He was a slave. And this, of course, this is drawings of the monument. We'll take you up to see.
Something
yeah,
that.
We're going to do an interview for those people from Athens. An interview. Remember the girl that came down the stairs the other
Of course,
day?
take your phone over.
He's going to do an interview.
Corliss,
What?
take your phone over there somewhere.
Oh, they aren't taping. Oh, it's okay. Cool. Can you call you when you get it?
I'm going to do a short introduction just so they know who, in case the tape gets lost. My name is Deanda Johnson. I'm interviewing Mr. Glen Miller at his home near Bidwell, Ohio on August 10th, 2007 for the African American Presence in the Ohio River Valley Oral History Project. Mr. Miller, can you please, one more thing before we start. If whenever I ask you a question, you just answer in a complete sentence. So if I say, what is your name? My name is, because my voice is going to be cut out of the tape. Mr. Miller, can you please state your full name and spell it for us?
My name is Glen Miller, G-L-E, 2 N's. My middle name is, I won't give you that, but my middle initials are, and my last name is Miller. Glen R. Miller, that's who I go by. I don't like my middle name. I don't like it too well, so I don't use it. I was actually named after my father. My father's name was, and this will probably give you a hint of what my middle name is. His name was Rudolph Odell, and of course they called him Doc. And a lot of people never really ever knew what his name was because that's what he's called, and I was named after him. So, yeah, I'm usually just known by Glen R.
Now, why was he called Doc?
That was a name that he had from his childhood up. I don't know why they had the name. It's what everybody always knew him by, and that's what he always went by. That's just like my mother. My mother's name was Sylvia Elizabeth, and her nickname was Charlie. Nobody really ever knew what her name was. She always went by Charlie. They always thought maybe her name was Charlotte, but her name was actually Sylvia. But from her childhood up, I think one of her uncles was named Charlie Cordell. I think that made where she got her name from. But, you know, it's just nicknames more or less sometimes stick more than your actual name does.
What was your mother's maiden name?
Jackson.
Can you tell me a little bit about your parents, where they were born, when they were born?
My dad was born on the Lambert lands, as your interview is going to hopefully talk about in a little bit, and he was born in 1903, March of 26. My mother was born down in the lower part of Gallia County in a little place called Patriot, Ohio. She was born in a white community. In fact, probably know that all the other cemeteries in Gallia County and all the state of Ohio and all of the United States of America up until a certain time were segregated cemeteries. Well, on her side, her family is buried in the white cemetery. All of my grandparents and her brothers and her sisters. Also on my mother's side, which was the Jackson side, there was 22 in that family. They had, I think they had 3 or 4 sets of twins. Now, a lot of them on her side of the family were dead before she was ever born. They weren't all in the house at the same time, but it was quite a big family.
How did your mother's family get to that part of Ohio? Do you know how they came to reside in that small town?
Well, rumor has it. Now, I don't know, and I've never really researched that part of it. But down in Patriot, my grandmother supposedly come here with the Carter, and there was Carter plantations out of Virginia. Whether it's the same Carters, I don't know, but they were intertwined with that family. So I kind of think that might have been how they got here. I don't know.
Now, what is your date and place of birth?
I was born in 1940, April 28th.
And where were you born?
I was born on Lambert lands, born in a log cabin, one-room log cabin, and don't remember anything about it, and I don't remember ever living on the Lambert land. But Daddy, he moved around a lot and worked for different people, and after I was born, well, he moved, and we moved down into where my mother came from. He lived down there for a while, and then he moved back up here, and then we bought a place in a little village of Porter, and that's where, in 1942, so that's where I grew up.
What year were you born again?
1940.
Okay. Do you know if you were born at home or in a hospital?
Home, where there wasn't no such thing. Had a midwife, and the midwife always said, and she'd always tell me, I caught you. And her name was Romy Harrington. And Romy Harrington, she was off of the Millers. In my ancestry, as you'll probably talk about a little bit later on, there was 3 brothers that come out of that, and Rome Harrington come off of one of the brothers' side. So everybody was just more or less related in the community. Mm-hmm.
Now, you talked about your father moved around a lot.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of work did he do?
Farm. Daddy was a farmer in the younger years, but after he got older and we moved and got settled in Porter, he more or less did what was called sawmill work. He worked on a sawmill the biggest part of the rest of his life. But farm was the biggest basic wage that he had.
Now, in Porter, what type of community was Porter that you grew up in?
Type meaning?
Was it integrated, segregated?
It was integrated. Yeah, they were. They were probably 4 or 5 black families, and the rest of the community was white.
And how big was the community approximately?
Probably when I grew up, Porter probably had 75 to 80 people in it.
Mm-hmm. So it's a small community.
Mm-hmm.
What was the major industry that people worked in around Porter?
Farm.
Just to go back a little bit, what is your family's ethnic or racial background?
Well, black and Indian, I guess, and a little bit of everything else sprinkled in, I guess you might say.
What race or ethnicity do you identify with personally?
Black.
You talked a little bit about your parents, but now just to go back and talk about your grandparents, who were your father's parents?
My father's parents? My father's name was John Oliver Miller. Well, you want me to give them all to you?
Yeah.
Okay, it's easier for me if I start at the bottom and come up. I'm 5 generations from Bedford County, Virginia. My great-great-great-grandfather, 5 generations back, his name was Isham, and he come from Bedford County, Virginia. He had 3 sons, William, Wyatt, and Powell. I come from the Powell side of the family. And from Wyatt's son, he had his son that come from my side was John Oliver Miller, then my father, which was Rudolph Odell, and then to me. Okay.
And how about your father's mother? What was her name?
Her maiden name was Evans. Now there was another black community between Porter and we'll say Galplis. It was called Buck Ridge. Her maiden name was Evans, and she come out of that community. There was different pockets and settlements of black people in this area that I assume that came out of slavery, and it used to be a lot of black-owned property in this area. Of course, now, as we know, it's all gone. But at one time, there was several hundred acres that was black-owned in different communities and pockets of Gay County.
Can you name some of those communities or pockets?
Yeah, well, like I said, we come out of what we called Morgan, which is what you've known as Lambert land. Down where my grandmother come from, she come from a place that was called Buck Ridge. Down the other way, there was another community, what was called Campaign. It was Campaign Creek. This is Campaign Creek, sits right behind us, and it was called Campaign. All of these little different communities they moved into, all of them had their own churches and what have you. Bidwell, as Porter was the underground railroad site. Bidwell was not as old as Porter. It really didn't come into existence till a railroad come through. But there's another community in Bidwell, and that's where the church was in this area. But then on up in Benton, there was another settlement up there where the Howes lived. Over in Salem Center, there was another pocket of blacks over there. And the reason that the church was built in my father's community, which we call Morgan, it was built in between Salem Center and Morgan, where the 2 communities come together and made up a church. The church up there was actually originated around 1845. Mm-hmm.
And do you know how the church got started, or who started the church at Morgan Bethel?
Well, not really. I don't know who started, but like my wife has already said there was other people that were already in their area, and the Powells and the Jameses, and like I said, there was another set of Evanses that come from over in Salem Center, and they all come together and converged there at that time. So I'd say it was just a community thing that started. Also at Morgan Bethel, where Morgan Bethel sits now, they also had a school. The first school sat right across from where the church was. Then later on, after the community got more populated and more set up, they built another school that's set up in the Lambert lands.
And what was the name of that school? Do you know?
Just, I don't know what the actual name was, just Morgan, I guess that's what they call it. Really, everything around here goes by Morgan. This is Morgan Township. The town house is over back of us, and everything here is usually just called Morgan. So I'd say it was just a Morgan colored school is probably what it was called.
Do you know when your grandparents, your father's parents, were born?
Not without looking it up in my book. I've got it all down, but not right off the top of my head. No, I don't know that.
How about your mother's parents? Can you please tell me their names and where they were born?
My grandfather's name, or my mother's father's name was Andrew Jackson, and his wife's name was Catherine, and her maiden name was Evans.
And where were they born?
I don't really know that much about that side of the family. I'd like to research it sometime, and I don't really know where to start. Some says they come from out of North Carolina, some out of Virginia. I don't know really. We've never really got to that part of it. I'd love to do that and love to find out, just exactly what that part plays in that. But I do know that the community they come from was a lot different than the communities that were in this area. They were more integrated than what they were up here.
Can you please tell me how many children did your parents have?
Well, on my mother's side, as I told you before, there was 22 of them.
She had 21.
My grandmother.
Oh, okay.
Or are you talking about my mother?
Yeah, your mother.
My mother. My mother only had two, me and my sister. My sister's 11 years older than I am. She had other children, but they were lost in childbirth. But there's 11 years difference between me and my sister, and we only had two in my family. I guess that's one reason that we, as far as feeding the family, we never had it as hard as some of the rest of them did, because our family was small.
When was your sister? You said she was born 11 years before you?
She was born in 1928 or 29. She just had a birthday the 1st of August, so she don't like to tell people that, but...
Can you please tell me your wife's name?
My wife's name is Corliss Marie, and her maiden name is Borden.
And when was she born?
She was born July the 7th, 1943.
Four. You gave her a year. And where was she born?
She was born in a little community which sits between Porter and Gallipolis of Evergreen. It's just a little bump in the road, as you might say.
And how did you meet your wife?
Well, her mind's not as good as mine, but I think we always knew one another. Of course, I was 4 years older than she was, but I think where I really remember her is we were swimming in Raccoon Creek, and that's where in the country, that's where we went. Instead of going to pools, we had different creeks. Raccoon is a creek that's just as clear as a crystal, and it runs for 99 miles into the Ohio River. And one day we were swimming over there, and for some unknown reason, she made up in her mind that I was the man for her. And after that, it just accelerated from that. Her story's probably different, but that's the truth.
And how long did you guys date before you got married?
Oh, probably year and a half.
So how did you ask her to marry you?
Well, that's nuts. She asked me. I was awful quiet and shy.
So how did she ask you to
No,
marry
I just said that. No, I don't know. It's just something that we just felt that it was something that we did. And really, especially living in a rural area, As you said, everything, if you wanted to meet a girl, you went to the church or some other function was going on, and there really wasn't that many to choose from. But some way or another, it all worked out by divine intervention that you got the right person for the right time, you know.
And when you guys dated, what kind of places would you take her? Or what kind of activities would you do?
Well, there wasn't too much of that either. I remember when I took her to her prom. We went to, after the prom was over, we went to Bob Evans' restaurant. And like all the rest of it, drove around the restaurant, you know, with all the cars and all the boys and girls and things like that. And then we'd go to, at a drive-in movie that we'd go to. But other than that, there wasn't really too much going on. And of course, they were not in our day and time, but it was something similar to the times that the older people had. They used to have what they used to call suppers, where they'd come together and have parties. Well, when we come along, the teenagers would have, you know, little parties and things that they'd go to and play music and dance and things of that nature. But really, as far as going out into society and socializing, as far as more or less towns and cities and places like I did, we didn't have that.
When did you guys get married?
We got married September the 30 days has it, 30th September 1961.
And where did you get married?
We got married at the pastor's house. We went down to his house. In fact, his name was Reverend C.M. Payne, and he had was the pastor of Mount Carmel Baptist Church in Bidwell. And by that time, he had retired from pastoring, and he was pastor emeritus. And we were the last couple that he married before he died. And we got married at his house. Mm-hmm.
And do you remember what you guys wore?
Well, it wasn't a suit. I'll tell everybody, we only had one suit in Porter, and I got that when I graduated. And another good friend of mine, which was white, when he got married, he borrowed my suit to marry his wife. So really that our official dress in Porter, now Porter is distinct from Bidwell. We were as much different as daylight and dark. Kids in Bidwell, they were more society-oriented, I guess you might say. But in Porter, our official dress was blue jeans and T-shirts. And like I said, nobody owned a suit. In fact, if you come out of the house with a suit on, they would have probably hung you, I believe. It's just that way that we were, yeah, the way we were raised.
Talk a little bit about your schooling. Where did you attend school?
I started the school at a two-room colored school. I started school in 1946. First 1 through 3rd grades was in one room, taught by Miss Bernice Borden. And then when you left there, you went over this right next door, and the building was hooked together into the 4th and the 5th grade, or the 4th, 5th, and the 6th grade. And that was taught by Miss Beulah Johnson at that time, or Miss Beulah Anderson, I reckon, at that time. And when you there, then for someone, well, I know the reason that they did, but then you went into the, oriented into the public school system at 7th through junior high and on into high school. Mm-hmm.
So you and your wife went to the same colored school in Bidwell then? How far was the school from your home?
Well, as I said, we lived in Porter. The school was in Bidwell. Where we lived, I walked to school. I probably could have rode a bus, but it's just something that everybody in Porter did, so we walked. I never did really think too much about being segregated in a one-room colored school, because black and whites walked to school. We walked past the white school, which was at Bidwell Elementary, and our school was on below that. They stopped and went to school at the Bidwell, and we went on down to the colored school. Come back, and we'd get together, and we'd walk back to Porter. And I don't know, we never ever thought about it. It's just the way that things were. You never questioned. You just come. That's just the way it was done. You know, you never thought about being segregated or set apart or Jim Crow or equal or anything like that. It's just the way it was. And you just took it for granted that that's the way it was, and you never really thought about it.
Now, do you remember any racial incidents happening when you were younger in the town, in the area?
How young?
Like just growing up.
Oh, well, like I said, not really, because you know we all played and together, and you know we were. Another thing that was distinct about Porter and Bidwell. Bidwell had all the girls. Where I grew up in Porter, of course, my sister was 11 years older than I was, and there was all boys in Porter. There wasn't a girl growing up in my age in Porter. So we'd get together and we'd have what you call a war. We'd have a war with Bidwell because they had all the girls, and that was just a difference. And I don't remember any really racial things that really happened. Growing up at that time in the 40s and the 50s, that before desegregation come, you knew your place and what it was and things like that. But as children growing up, we all played together and went to school together and did everything together as kids will. In fact, we didn't really realize that there was any difference. You know how children are; they don't really see color until they get to the point you're older. Now, I do remember that the boy that I grew up with, me and him was good buddies, and we grew up together. In fact, we graduated together. And I can remember, I think that the first time that I ever remembered him really realizing that I was different than he was, and that's when we were in high school. And he went off and he started dating his white girls and things like that. And I was left out of the picture. And I never ever really thought about it, because during the summer we was as close as two peas in a pod. We did everything together. I remember one time when we was growing up and all the boys had gone to the military, and me and him was the only two boys that was left in Porter. And we had a tradition that when Halloween would come, you turn toilets over. I don't know whether you probably being a city girl, you don't probably know anything about that, but that's one thing that we did. You Halloween and you turned over toilets. And I remember we made a pact with us. We wasn't nobody there but us, and we said we was going to keep the tradition going. So we turned over 13 toilets by ourselves. And and that was just some of the things that we did, as country boys and growing up in the community. But I really don't remember any racial things that actually happened in my life growing up. Now, when I actually really come to the conclusion of what segregation was and what being separate was when we graduated from high school. In my yearbook, another good friend of mine, that we were good friends in high school, they said that when we always put in who you're going to, what you're going to be and how the future's going to look, and they said that he was going to own a chain of restaurants and I was going to be the head cook. So, and I made up my mind right then, I'll never wash a pot and pan, or I'll never work in a kitchen, and I never have, as far as that's concerned. But still, on the other side of the coin, another story is that at that time, we always took a trip to Washington, D.C., the senior class, and I was the only black boy that graduated in my class, and there were some girls in my class, but I was the only black boy. And we got on the bus and left from the Bidwell area, as you might say, and early in the morning, drove to Maryland, stopped at the bus stop, got off, and the first thing that I seen when I got off the bus was white and black restrooms. I'd never ever experienced it, never even heard of it, never thought about it. And what it did for me was that being the only black boy that got off, it made me feel just about that high. It let me know right then that I was different than everybody else, and that I had a long, hard road to hoe as far as my race was concerned. But up until that point, I never really realized that I was any different than anybody else.
Now, could you stay at the same hotel?
We stayed at the Annapolis Hotel in Washington, D.C., but just at the bus stops, and of course we was together with the school groups. They couldn't hardly get you down there and separate you, but we got to D.C. and we as a group, we went and saw went to the Smithsonian Institute and seen all the sites in D.C. and stayed at the same hotel. In fact, me and the good friend of mine that we stayed in the same. But the three of us did. The one that I grew up with in Porter, and the one that was a good friend of mine in school. We all three stayed in the same room together. But no, we never had any problem other than just the bus stops. And I don't remember whether I used the restroom or not. I don't remember. In fact, I don't imagine I did. But I don't remember that. I just remember seeing the sign as we got off, the signs on the doors, the colored and the white.
So you were able to eat at the restaurants with them?
Oh yeah, no problem. In D.C., wasn't no problem in D.C. But of course, we never stopped at any restaurants in Maryland or or things like that. But just there is the only thing that I really ever seen. Mm-hmm.
Now, what year did you graduate from high school?
1958.
And how many colored people were there in your class?
It was, of course, me, which was the only boy, and they were 1, 2, 3, 4 girls.
And what did you do after graduating from high school?
Well, the first job that I did, you see, my dad worked on a sawmill, and that was hard, man. That was, of course, my father, and I'll have to explain to him a little bit about him. My father wouldn't take an easy job. Sweeping floors and mopping and he wouldn't do that. I remember back during World War II, a lot of the men that didn't go to the war, they would go to places like Vandalia, and they made parts for airplanes and things like that, you know. And the only job that the black man could get was cleaning up after the whites did their job. In other words, sweeping up, cleaning up. Well, Daddy didn't last very long up there because he didn't go in for sweeping. He come back home and he went to work on a sawmill. Then after I got out of school in 1958, he said, you know, there's not much to do here other than working on a farm. I went to work on a sawmill. And I don't know whether you know about a sawmill, but anyway, it's saws logs. You saw lumber, just like lumber here. You know, you saw 1x4s, 2x4s, 2x8s, 2x6, whatever, you know, that you can get out of a log. In other words, they saw big logs. So you got a saw that stands probably 3.5, 4 foot in diameter. And I was 18 years old, and I went to work for this man on a sawmill. And my job was what they called an off-bearer. Everything was manual, you know, it was all manual labor. And you had the man that did the sawyer. He stood behind, he had a lever. And the log rolled over, he pulled a lever, and it went through the saw. It cut the slab off, which was the outside bark of the tree. Well, it would come back. When that would come back, the slab, which to the outside of the tree, would come back. The man that was the off-bearer had to get the slab, and he had to carry it as far as up to there and drop it and pile it up. When he come back, he'd have the log turned, and use another slab waiting. In other words, it was just a constant run. Daddy heard him say many times that the first trip, he smoked a pipe. He'd put the pipe in his mouth. The next time he'd put the tobacco in the pipe, and the next time he'd light it. In other words, it was just that way. In other words, you know, like I was going to tell you about me, I went to work on this sawmill, and it was just a dead run. You know, you off-bared, you carried the slabs, and you stacked the lumber, and then and if you had any spare times, you got under the saw and shoveled the sawdust. Well, this man that I was working for, just me and him, the log was big and he couldn't turn it. So the log would go through on a trolley, and the saw was here and the log was here. Well, when I went through the saw to go help him turn the log, I went through it all right. But when I come back, well, I drug my hand through it, and that's where I lost that finger. And the ironic thing about that is that when I cut that finger off, that it never skint, never touched any of these fingers, but he just hit that saw just right and just took that finger off to right there. And the thing of it was that a little while after that I had mine done, that there was another man, he was a white man, was working on a sawmill, and he went to go by it, and he tripped and fell in the saw, and it just cut him open. But I used to think about that and think about, you know, just how close that was, because when, you know, the saw stood that high, and when I went through it, I was, you know, running, you know, going, and I just drug my hand through it. But I could have put the whole thing, or a piece of clothing could have got into it, could have jerked me into it and did it. But that just some of the things that we did. Daddy worked on the sawmill for, I'd say, for 30 years. In fact, like I said, it was hard work. It was hard, brutal work. He was ruptured on both sides, and he'd have to lay down of a morning to get his ruptures to go back in to go to work. He wasn't off. Yeah, what it was, well, I using a term, but your intestines come out, you'd lift so hard that it would tear your lining of your stomach, and your intestines would come out. Well, they'd come out, and if you didn't put them back, well, they'd swell out, see. And then but he'd have to lay down in the morning, and you wore a thing, what you called a truss. It was a thing that had a big rubber ball on it, and he'd go against that, and it would shove it and hold it in. Well, he'd have to lay down of a morning to get them to go back in. He was ruptured on both sides. And he worked that way for 20 years. And he really didn't get operated on and get them taken off until after he retired at 60-some years old. But it was hard, brutal work. And like I said, that's what Daddy liked. He wouldn't take an easy job. And I remember another job that me and him worked together on. We had a job working for a guy, and we was picking corn. Now, you had a corn picker, pulled behind a tractor, goes in a big wagon, runs on 4 wheels. Then me and Daddy would be at the corn crib, and they'd bring it in. They'd unhook a wagon, and we'd shovel it in. Well, me and him, he wouldn't let me outwork him, and I wouldn't let him outwork me. And we, when they would bring another wagon in with that corn picker and the tractor and the wagon, we'd be sitting there waiting for him for another load to come in. And we worked so good and so fast and hard that when the man, he was tight on the bark on a tree. And when he got through that evening, that you know, pretty, I got watched his money. And he was so well pleased with our work that we did that he gave us extra money for doing that. But that just, everything back when I grew up was hard. You know, as far as working, it wasn't anything as plants or anything like that. And then another thing too, that people in our area, especially in rural communities, not only my dad, but other parents too, you only got jobs that nobody else wanted. I remember a fellow over to Bidwell over, he got hurt in the mine, he had a stiff leg, and his job was to go around and clean out outside toilets. You know, just menial tasks that nobody else wanted, that's what you got. But we didn't know any better, you know, we didn't, everybody was in the same boat, white and black. Nobody at that time had a whole lot, nobody had a lot of money, and we all just, you know, survived on what we had. And like I said, as far as food go, now, not like my wife, now we raised a lot of our food. We raised hogs, and we didn't raise beef, but we raised hogs, we raised gardens, picked every berry there was in a 10-mile radius. My mother, I don't know how they did it. My mother, well, to make a long story short, I told you my sister was 11 years older than I was. She took a picture in 11th grade with a shirt on. Now, she was a girl and I was a boy. I took a picture when I was in the 2nd grade with the same shirt on. What my mother did, she took the shirt after my sister got through and she cut it down to where I could wear it. My mother could take a needle and thread and make anything. In her spare time, she would sew and make clothes, dresses. We never made any pants or anything like that, but shirts. And in her spare time, she never threw away anything. She'd keep the rags that she didn't use for patches or anything like that or making things with. And I've seen her braid a 9x10 rug. Well, it wasn't braided, but however they did it together to put on the floor. And I don't know how they did it. Now, I heard my wife said that they had electric. I can remember when they threw the creosote pole off in our yard. I can remember having a lamp light. After I went to school, we went to school, and in probably 47 or 48, they finally come and put electric in the house, but we didn't have electric. And I can remember sitting there, you had a battery radio that we listened to, and we had things like that. And one of the great things that we listened to was Grand Ole Opry. You know, everybody, white or black, everybody was country. You know, we listened to all of those old country singers and all of them. We sung country western song, wasn't country western, we sung country song. And had another show, probably you've heard say, was Randy's Record Shop. You've heard of that. Gallatin, Tennessee, you know, and that's another that we listened to. The old battery radio you turn on and it would fade out, you know, and you'd have to sit right up close to it, you know, and listen to it. And you listen to the fights, Joe Louis and all those come along, great fighters back at that time. And really, you know, we didn't have much, but you were satisfied with what you had. And like I said, I've seen my mother, like I said, I was telling you about her, make rugs and things of that, and it seemed like they had time to do things. And we picked berries. I know that there was only 4 of us in the family, but we'd pick enough berries that when winter would come, we'd have as high as 150, 200 quarts of berries under the bed. We'd start picking raspberries, dewberries, and blackberries. And we'd pick clear through till there wasn't another berry to pick. She canned every apple, dried apples. I don't know whether you ever heard of dried apples, greens. She knew every green that there was, you know, raised a garden. Potatoes, we'd take them out in there and put them in a big hill and leave them outside. We had smokehouse. We killed 2 big hogs. We'd send to Tennessee or Nashville, and they'd get little chickens. They'd come through the mail, and you'd get your chickens through the mail. You'd raise them up. You had your chickens on Sunday. You never had chicken any other time, but on Sunday. You never got tired of it. Everything always tastes good. And another thing too, that with my mother, I didn't like a whole lot of different foods, vegetables and things like that in the garden. About the only kind of potatoes I liked was fried. Cabbage and green beans and things. I didn't like that stuff, but I liked dried beans. And whenever we'd finish a pot of beans, she'd put another body of beans on. I could eat beans 3 times a day, just the way it was. But anyway, and fried meat. Huh?
What kind of beans? White
beans. We eat very soup beans, what we used to call little white soup beans. We didn't eat too much of the other. But fried pork, we eat that every day. She'd get up in the morning, and like I said, Daddy worked hard. He'd go to work on a sawmill. He'd leave probably 6:30 or 7 o'clock. And I don't remember ever getting up, going to school, of not having a full breakfast on the table. Did it with wood, not coal, wood. Daddy didn't have chainsaws back that time. Daddy chopped enough wood to keep the cook stove going and the heating stove going, and besides going to work. And she'd get up every morning. We'd have biscuits, baked every morning, fried potatoes, what we call Joel bacon. It wasn't sliced bacon like we had now, but Joel bacon, and just a full meal on the table, you know, and every morning, 3 meals a day, and plus had time to do all the other things. She took care of the garden, the chickens, and picked the berries and the greens and everything else, and I don't know how they did it. We don't have time to do anything, you know, but then we got all the modern convenience to do it, but they did. I don't know how they did it. But it was just a way of life and way of doing things, and like I said, everything tastes good. You know, you enjoyed eating because you never got too much of anything. I can remember my mother used to bake, and she baked pies and cakes, and she'd make donuts and all them kind of things. And my pie was apple, and that's one great thing about having a small family. When she'd bake an apple pie, she'd make an apple pie for me, and I'd have an apple pie for myself. But that's just some of the little things that she did growing up.
What were your chores? If your mom was doing all this and your dad was doing all that, what kind of chores did you have growing up?
Well, mowing the grass, mowing the lawn, taking care of the chickens and things like that. Wouldn't let me chop too much wood because that was kind of, yeah, yes ma'am. Well, wherever.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about the chores you had growing up.
Basically, like I said, picking berries wasn't a job I despised. I never did like to pick greens. Of course, like I said, my mother knew every kind of green it was. I never did really get into that, but after she got older, then especially along the roads, road like this, gravel road, there was a lot of wild lettuce, and there was what you call mouse's ear, naradoc, and all that kind of greens. Now I know them, but there was 100 other different kind of greens that she used to pick, and I used to just despise to do it. And like I said, with berries, now especially days like this, it's hot, you know, and muggy. Well, you'd have to get up way before daylight, and then you'd have to maybe walk for a half, 3/4 of a mile back in the field and pick berries. You'd pick berries and into what you call, well, like that bucket over a big 3 or 4 gallon water bucket full, or all that you could get. Then you'd pick them berries and try to get, you know, out of the field before it got too miserably hot. And that was things that I didn't like. Now, Daddy never did do that because he worked out, but usually the children and the wife or the mother had that chore to do. But still, after you got back, now she still had to clean them berries, and she had to get ready and prepare them and can them and put them in the jar. And I don't, still to this day, I grew up in that time, but I just can't comprehend at how they did all the work that they did with what they had to work with. And like I said, you know, and still had time to sit down and do other things when evening time. Of course, like I said, you know, we didn't have, before television come, you had the radio, but, you know, you was usually in bed by 9 or 10 o'clock, you know. And I just never could understand. Of course, you know, the day started early, but I just never could understand how they did it. But life wasn't, you know, really that hard. Now, after I grew up and went out and went to work and started working on farms and things like that, you know, but around home it wasn't really that much to do, especially living in a little village, you know. Like I said, biggest thing that you had was your garden, and you had your chickens, and plus you had your lawn and things like that to take care of, but really there wasn't that much to do. In fact, growing up, after you got all that done, our boys that I grew up with, our daily chore was to play. And we did everything. Like I said, we'd go swimming, and we'd go out and we'd build log cabins and steal chickens, and and I tell my grandkids, I never eat frog legs. You know, you can buy a frog leg. Well, the way we did it, and we've heard people eating them. You know, we'd go out and we'd catch frogs, just no matter what size he was, and he'd probably be 4 or 5 boys. So some of them would say, well, I get the back legs. Back legs has got the meat on them. There's not really that much on them. Then you divide it up. Somebody get the front legs, and then somebody get the back, and all you had was the skin. And what we'd do, we'd build a fire. And you'd take that little frog and stick him on a stick and hold him over that fire. And really, the thing whenever we'd get done, you just heat him up. But that's just some of the things that we did as boys.
You ate them?
Well, yeah, we eat them, but you know, I mean, heck, but as kids, you know, that's what we did. But you know, basically, they wasn't really a lot of, you know, just 6, 7, 8 hours a day work. There was other things that we did.
What are some other games or things you did for fun growing up?
Well, I tell everybody, and things really changed from my generation to my children's generation. I played basically the same games that my father played. You know, we shot marbles, we played, we had a game we called Roly Hole. I don't know whether you ever heard of that or not. But anyway, what you do, you'd have a bare yard, and it'd be relatively smooth, and what you do is kind of like playing croquet, only you did it with a marble. And you'd put holes in the ground, and you'd take your marbles and shoot into that hole. Then you'd go around it and come back, and then when you got back to the where you started from, then you had was able to shoot other marbles and keep what you got. But you had different, just kind of like croquet, and you go around and you had to get in them holes before you did it. And like I said, we played marbles and ball and things of that nature, you know. And mostly, as boys, we spent the biggest of our time back in the woods and things like that, you know. Before we got to be teenagers, you know, as young kids. It's a wonder some of us hadn't got drowned, but we, you know, ponds, you know, we'd go swimming in ponds and things like that, and some of them would be 12, 16, 20 foot deep, you know, but we was fortunate, none of us ever got drowned.
How about going to the movies?
After I got to be a teenager, me and another boy, well, of course, we didn't have cars. What we'd do, we'd hitchhike to Gallipolis. You know, you go out there and you'd hitchhike in there, and you go to the Saturday matinee, go down, and as my wife said, you'd watch all of the old cowboys, you know, and things like that. Then right next door, they had, well, I guess you'd call it we call them a beer joint, but it was a tavern. And you'd go in there, and it was Eddie's place. Of course, in Gallipolis, it's all burnt down now. And what he'd have you go in and buy a hot dog. You get a hot dog for 8 cents, and you put mustard on it, not sauce, but mustard on it, and you get a bottle of orange pop. And man, that was some of the best things. I believe I could eat a dozen of them things. But it was just, you know, just something that you didn't get a whole lot of, and everything, like I said, just tastes good. And that's what we did on Saturday. And I don't remember what the movie was, you know, 15, 20 cents maybe, I don't know. But it didn't take much money. But of course, another thing too that you have to realize, back in the 50s, and of course that's when that was, after I got to be that age, was money wasn't that plentiful. I remember an older friend of mine, he lives up in Jackson County, and he's in his 70s at this time, but he says he can remember of having a bottle of pop all by himself that he could drink it. Down around Porter with a bunch of us boys, if you get a bottle of pop and open it up, it's just like a bunch of winos. You'd have to pass that thing around and give it to everybody, because, you know, pop was a nickel, but you didn't get that many nickels, and it was just a luxury that you never. And I notice my kids today, I've got keep pop out there in the refrigerator, and we got pop out there in the garage, and they'll get a can and open it up and set it around. Well, back when I was growing up, you didn't do that, because, you know, it was a luxury. It's something that you just never got enough of.
How would you get the money to go to the movies?
Well, we'd work. Like I said, I'd mow grass for people. And of course, the guy that me and him usually went to, and he usually financed mine, because he stayed with a guy who worked on a man's farm, and he had a job. But usually, you know, there was odd jobs that you could do. It was all hard, and like I said, just mowing grass. You had them old reel type mowers. I know you've probably seen them. But you'd let your grass get up too high, and man, it was a hard job, you know, especially if you're a little boy. And they wouldn't let you cut the grass until it got up to where, you know, they usually give you 25, 30 cents to cut it. But man, you earned every dime of it. But like I said, you know, that's where you got your money. And I remember we'd go up the road, another guy raised tobacco. And we'd go up there and work all day, setting out tobacco. And what you did, you took a wooden peg and sharpened the end of it, and you'd put it in the ground and put the tobacco plant in it and cover it up. Well, you know, you didn't have sense enough to get a pair of gloves, and your hands were soft anyway. And man, you'd wear a big blister in your hands, and you'd give you 50 cents. You made 50 cents for working up there all day setting out tobacco. And I can remember one time in Pacific that me and another boy, one of her cousins, we went up there and set out tobacco, and that's when they had the old station down there before it burnt down. And like I said, at that time, you could take 50 cents and you could eat pop and candy on it for 2 days. And I come down there, and we was playing out there on the swing out back of that filling station, and I lost my 50 cents. And I always swore up and down that he found my 50 cents. He swore he didn't, but I never got to spend my 50 cents. But I do. I think bird stole my. They didn't steal it. I lost it, and he found it, and he never gave it back to me. But that's just some of the things that we used to do growing up. And like I said, it was a good time. It was a fun time.
Now, was the movie theater in Galpost segregated?
Not when I went in there. Not when I. Now it may have been before. I don't remember some of the other guys talking about it. They had to set up in the balcony. But when I started going in there, then no, it wasn't. It wasn't. Now there were some restaurants in Galpost that were segregated. You know, because I never went to them. But some of the older people, you know, they knew about it and had some problems with them. But I never did. I never did have anything like that.
How about roller skating? Did you roller skate as a kid?
No, I never did roller coasters. Like I said, you know, until I got to be 19, 20 years old, well, you didn't have a car and you couldn't get to Galpost every Saturday like that. But no, we didn't do too much roller skating. I never did learn how to roller skate. Now my kids did, you know, they did, but I never did. Heck, I'd break my neck. In fact, what we would do now, like I said, in the wintertime, we had a hill that well, it wasn't as steep as that, but we had sleds, you know, and we'd sleigh ride all winter, build fires, stay up there till 10 or 11 o'clock at night. And we had another part of the hill was about as steep as that and right there. And what we'd do, we'd pour water on it. And it would be nothing but a sheet of ice. And you'd skate down that hill. And man, there's one guy over there, of course, he was older than I was, he was coming back up it. And when he come up the hill, his feet come out and he come down and hit that ice on it and black both his eyes around that thing. But you know, back at that time, you know, the winters seems like it, and you didn't get out of school from winter time. And snow, it'd start snowing in November and snow would stay on the ground clear up until March. And we'd sleigh ride all winter, you know, and we'd have a big time. Like I said, you know, go build fires and, you know, and get up there and sleigh ride off the hill.
How about fishing?
Yeah, we went fishing, but we didn't fish too much because, I don't know, they wouldn't, if we had to fish, this was the biggest creek that we could really come to. But we could go to the little creeks, you know, and catch little fish about like that. And we'd take them home and clean them. We'd eat every one we catch, you know, but we never did too much really go into for that fish. Now, after I got older to be a teenager, and I did a lot of hunting, but I never did do much fishing.
What did you hunt for?
Well, rabbit, squirrel, deer, you know.
And would you eat everything you...
Oh yeah, groundhog. Yeah, I remember another talking about a groundhog. We used to, you know what a groundhog is. Well, anyway, a groundhog is I think has got more of the wild taste than any other game that you can get. Rabbits are pretty good, and squirrel you don't get the wild gamey taste. But a groundhog, especially as an old one, you get a strong gamey taste. Well, we got the idea that you get a young groundhog and you put him on a grill and you barbecue him. You know, just like you would anything else. And you barbecue him, and it don't taste like a groundhog. Well, I brought one home, and I told my wife, you know, to barbecue him. Now, instead of her cutting the thing up, she just left it whole, put it in there, and barbecued that groundhog, and I couldn't eat that thing. Or just put him out there and there he laid, you know. That broke me eating the barbecued groundhog. But we did. Now I do. Now she won't. Now she won't eat. Her dad did a lot of hunting, and that's what a lot of their meat was. But I did. I'll eat everything. My kids won't either. Very few of my children will eat wild meat. In fact, I used to raise hogs after we come here. Now my children, they wouldn't eat the hogs that I raised here. Down where we used to live, I raised a hog and I'd get a beef off the guy that I worked. Now my son would go up to his house and we'd butcher the hogs and the beef at the same time. He'd eat his, but he wouldn't eat mine. I used to, in fact, when we was growing up, in the wintertime, that's the way that my dad and my family, that's the way they supplemented the meat, was through hunting, you know, rabbits and things like that. And my mother, you'd get, you know, go out and get a lot of rabbits, which she'd can them. I don't know whether you've ever heard of a canned rabbit. Of course, you call it cold packing them. We take them and hang them out in the smokehouse, and you call dry rabbit, you know, and then, but it was good. You know, it tastes a whole lot different that way than it would just get one and kill them. Am I boring you to death?
No, it's really interesting. I really like it. You give me lots of information. Can you tell me what church did you attend growing up?
I never really got into church until I was 35, pretty much after my youngest daughter was born, up in the 30s. Now my wife, she was church oriented, but I never. As another thing about growing up in Porter, we didn't do much church. We'd go around churches when special days was going on, just for the girls and things like that. But as far as going inside, we didn't do it. And I never really got started into church until I was around 30-some years old.
Can you talk a little bit about the church associated with the Lambert lands?
In what way?
Like what you know about the church. What was its name? What denomination it was?
In Morgan?
Yeah.
Well, it was Morgan Bethel, and like I told you before, it was founded in 1845. And as any little community goes. And back at that time, after my family came and after the ones was already in the area, there was at one time 26 families that lived in the area. And everything revolved around the church. You know, whether you belonged to the church or whether you didn't belong to the church, everything within the community revolved around the church. The functions, they used to what they called union meetings. They'd have anniversaries, and they would have revivals, and when those things would happen, that usually that was the only thing that was going on within the community, and that's where everybody come to. I can remember going to Morgan Bethel, and there wasn't that many a very good place for people to park, and there would be cars that would be lined on both sides of the roads for half a mile in each direction. But now you can go to church, and we've got all kind of different ways of going and all kind of methods of getting there, and you can find a place to park anywhere you want to. But that at that time, everything revolved around the church. And whether you, like I said, whether you were in the church or whether you weren't, a lot of times there'd be more people on the outside of the church than there would be on the inside of the church. Hot, man, they'd have all the windows up in there, and they seemed to be having a good time. But that's just the way that things were done back at that time.
Can you talk a little bit about your grandfather and the process of people getting kicked out of the church?
Oh, no, I like I told you before, my grandfather's name was Isham. And I don't know what Isham did, but the old minutes that we have, that we got a lot of our information from the old, older generation, that within the minutes of Morgan Bethel Church, that for some unknown reason they kicked him out of the church. And whatever it was, the old minutes that we had, and with the minutes that we had, went back to 1840s and the 1850s and clear on up into the 1860s. And we never ever seen where he ever come back. I don't know what he did, but I know some of the ones up there that went. Now some of them, they made bootleg whiskey and sold it, and they had things like that, and those were some of the things that they put you out for. Now what he did, I don't know. But my grandfather, he wasn't an ordained minister, but he was a lay minister. A lot of the preachers that were in the area, that they were lay ministers. And a lot of them, I don't know whether they were or not, because they were just about into just about everything you could think of.
Can you talk a little bit about, you said you didn't have a car, but did your parents own a car?
Oh yeah, Daddy. In fact, my dad, and like I said, Daddy was born in 1903, and he was born in what we call Morgan, where Lambert lands, and his mother and father were pretty prosperous people. They owned at one time 60 acres right up the road up here, and then they owned other places in and around Lambert land. And when my dad turned, he always said that when he got to be grown, he was going to move out. And he remember him saying one time, said when he turned, I think it was 18, said, man, he was born in March 26, and that time, it was still snowing hard in March. Said he was laying upstairs, under the big old heavy quilts and warm, and said he can remember his mother coming up and telling him, Doc, you're 18 now, well, it's time for you to go. And he was the first man to own a car in Morgan. He got the car. He worked for a guy by the name of Ray Grover, and he usually kept a lot of the people going in this area with jobs and what have you. And he worked for him, and he got the car before he learned how to drive it. And he bought the car off of him, and he'd bring him home in his car, and he'd take him back, and he finally learned how to drive it, and he finally got it. But he was the first man to own a car in Morgan.
And do you know what type of car he owned?
Not back at that time, but back at that time they had a lot of cars that we didn't have today. They had what they called the old Overlands, and I've heard him talk about them, and I've heard him talking about I don't know, what are some of the Model A's and Model T's. I can remember, so I don't remember having a Model T, but I can remember when I grew up of having a Model A and riding in the rumble seat and things like that. But Daddy always had a car. Never could drive too good, but he always had a car. I remember one time when he moved back down in where I told you where my mother come from. They lived up on a big hill, and the house set up there, and then down below it they had the coal house, I guess you'd say it. So Doc said Daddy never could drive too good. Nobody could back at that age, old man. And he got up there and he got out of the car, and when he got out of it, he got to either set the brake or put it in gear. So the car went over the hill. Instead of him getting in the car and putting on the brake, he was behind it trying to hold it back, and it went down and tore that coal house down. But just some of the things. Then another time they'd get together, and him and another family, my my mother's niece and her husband. They'd go out, you know, and of course my mother, she was the type of person that, like I said, had suppers and things like that. My mother could play organ, piano, guitar, mandolin, banjo. She could play all that kind of stuff. And anyway, this particular time, Daddy had the car, and my niece and her niece and her husband was with them, and they was going around to different trees. They was picking up walnuts and hickory nuts, how they used to do, you know, going along the road. So this, his niece's husband was a little short guy. He wasn't very big and had running boards on a car, if you can remember seeing or hearing about that. So he just thought, well, he'd instead of him getting in a car, just going from one tree to the next, he'd just get on the running board and ride on the car. Well, when he got in, it was a four-door car, and when he got in, he just jumped up there and put his hand on the post. And when he jumped up and put his hand on his post, his wife jumped in and slammed the door. So she slammed the door on his hand. He was short, and his feet come off the running board, and his legs wasn't long enough to hit the ground. And he was trying to get her to open up a door, and he was down there swinging in the door and her to get it open. I guess pretty comical thing. It wasn't too comical for him because it almost cut his fingers off. But anyway, Daddy always had automobiles as far as I can remember, clear up until he got too old to drive.
Now you just mentioned your mom playing several music instruments. Do you play any?
I can't play anything. I've got banjos. I've got one right in there right now. It's brand new. I've got an organ sitting in there every time I think of something. I've tried everything, and I've been trying to get my wife every time I think she'll buy it. I've been trying to get me a saxophone. I think I'll try that next. I've had banjos and guitars and pianos and organs, and I can't play anything. I think I could if I would just, you know, but I can pick out a tune on it, but other than that, I can't. Now, one thing about my mother's side of the family, and everyone of that family can play. All her brothers, and usually the ones that grew up in the family, which would have been her nephews, every one of them can play a guitar and everything because that's what, you know, they did. But I never did. I never learned. Daddy never could play anything. In fact, I never did hear Daddy sing. Daddy done a lot of humming. He'd hum, but I never did hear Daddy sing. But that was just a difference in the different sides of the family.
Now you mentioned Randy's record shop. What type of music was that?
Well, during the week they played blues and jazz and things like that, but on the weekends they played gospel music. In fact, that was, other than Grand Ole Opry, that was about the only. Of course, now after I got up, I started listening to other things to listen to on the radio. Green Hornet, you had the Lone Ranger, you had all of them cowboy things that come on. I didn't have a TV guide, so I'd write them out, and I knew exactly when they come on and where the number was and where to listen to them, you know. But that's basically what we did. And like I said, it was interesting. But you had the Shadow. You probably don't know anything about them kind of things, but anyway, they had all them kind of things on the radio, and you had to use your imagination. I did a lot of reading. I had about when I grew up to be a teenager, I probably had 150, 200 comic books. You know, well, of course they were different than what they are now. They had you know, the westerns, and you had Bugs Bunny and Porky Pig and the Looney Tunes and all of them kind. You know, and funny books now. Well, you know, one funny book that they had, it was kind of like they are now, and that was I can't think. Anyway, it went into the modern time where they had spaceships and all that kind of thing. I can't remember what it was. I never did care much about them. I always liked the animated cartoon. And we'd get them, you know, we'd trade them, you know, to different people. And I remember one time down in Porter where we lived, there was a maple tree sitting. I used to, summertime, I'd get up in that maple tree and sit up there and read up in that maple tree. So one day I was up there in summertime, and I was sitting up there, and I had me a good limb, you know, where you could lay in it, you know, and lean back. And I went to sleep. And I woke up and I forgot where I was. And I stepped out of that thing. And man, down through there I come. I just happened before I hit the ground, I grabbed a limb. But that thing skint me from the top of my head to the bottom of my feet. And that kind of put a brakes on me going up there reading in there. But I used to do a lot of reading. I used to read all of the dog stories. I liked dog stories when I was going to school. Didn't learn too much else, but I always liked to read things that were interesting to me. But those are the things that you use to occupy your time, you know. And I think reading, you know, it helps you as far as, you know, as learning how other people live and things of that nature.
You mentioned working at the sawmill, and what else did you do after that? You stopped working there?
Well, like I said, farms, worked on farms, and then I went to work for Well, a guy that had a wholesale car dealership, and that's when we got married. That's where I worked in, and that wasn't easy work either. What it was, he had a quota. He had 10 cars a week, and we'd buy our cars from up in your neck with Reichard Ford. You know where Reichard Ford is. We'd go up there and get them. And back in the 50s and 60s, that's when they were bad about rust. You know, your rocker panels and all those things. Man, it was just sometimes with nothing but a pile of rust. And we'd bring them in and we'd fix them up and put them on the auction. And we had a quota, 10 cars a week. And you'd have to work a lot of overtime, especially the auction was on a Tuesday. And on Monday, you'd go to work on Monday at 8 o'clock and work till 5. You'd come home and eat your supper. You go back 7 o'clock. And I've seen the sun come up many a morning. You'd work all day and all night until you got the cars to the auction. You get them up there about 1:30, 2 o'clock, and then you was off. But I did that for about 10 years. And then I left there, and I left him because finally I got to the place where I was making pretty good money from him. I got to be what you might call a working foreman. But as I told him, and my wife finally got me to realize that there wasn't any future in it. You know, I had to do something, you know, that was going to, one of these days I was going to get old and I was going to have to retire. So I went to work for the state, and things got easier then. Not physically, because that's where I got all this. When I went to work, left and went to work for the state, I weighed right around 170 pounds. I never had an ounce of fat on me, but I went to work up there and just almost just, you know, stopped work from what I was used to doing. You know, I was used to working hard. And almost drove me crazy because I was used to, you know, working hard and just suddenly just have to do that. But I got up there and, you know, and started eating them big meringue pies and things like that, and just didn't. And the first time I can remember, I went up from 170 to 205 pounds, you know, just almost overnight. And it almost killed me. I couldn't bend over and tie up my shoes, and it's just miserable. But after that, I've never been able to lose it. I never dreamed I'd ever have to worry about having excess weight, because it was just something that we never had to be bothered. My dad lived to be 86 years old, and when he died, he never had an ounce of fat on him. He just, you know, worked hard all of his life, and I do believe that, you know, that's what's a lot wrong with our generation today. We eat all these different kinds of food, but we don't work them all. My parents, neither one of them had heart trouble, or none of them had any high blood pressure, never knew what it was. And I've seen my mother fry pork, bacon, Joel bacon, which was nothing but fat, and then eat the meat, and then take a biscuit and sop a grease out of the skillet. Never had cholesterol, never had any of those things, but they worked, you know, and like I said, they worked off the excess things that we do, where with us, you know, everything turns to fat. That's my theory.